Welcome back. Trade tensions between the U.S. and China rising, with the latest salvo coming from President Donald Trump, who has threatened to halt imports of cooking oil from China.
He says the move is retaliation against Beijing for not purchasing U.S. soybeans, an act he's called economically hostile. Now, it comes shortly after Beijing imposed additional port fees on American-owned, operated, built or flagged vessels in response to U.S. charges on Chinese ships.
Beijing announced last week an expansion of export controls on rare earths. The U.S. president responded to that with a threat to roll out an additional 100% tariff on Chinese goods. For a closer look at the trade tensions between the U.S. and China, we are joined by Jeff Moon. He's the president of China Moon Strategies and former assistant U.S. trade representative for China. Thank you so much for joining us. Jeff, so we are just weeks from that trade deal deadline, yet both sides are back in full confrontation. How would you assess the current state of U.S.-China trade negotiations? Are we any closer to a deal or heading towards a deeper breakdown?
Well, I think things are pretty tough right now. I mean, it sort of reminds me of a tense basketball game when both sides are fighting at the net to get the ball and score. And sometimes the competition gets too rough. The referees need to remind everybody to stop pushing and elbowing each other so the game can go on for the benefit of all. I think we have a lot of ups and downs. The best latest news is that the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer today said that he thought that they would push through and get some kind of a summit. Apparently, a time has been reserved, I see in the press, for a meeting in South Korea. So I think we need to try to be optimistic, even though there's a lot of downside pressure on the bilateral relationship.
Well, Jeff, you've done this before as a trade guy to China, so I want you to dust off your hat, and I want to ask you whether this sort of tariff threat cycle of repeated easing to escalation and rinse and repeat again, has that ever worked with China before? I mean, it clearly has worked with a lot of other countries in the current context.
Well, in fact, there's nothing new here. All of the issues that you mentioned are old issues that have been there for a long time. Soybeans, for example, for the U.S. sort of confirms for Americans that China did not live up to its phase one deal in 2020 to buy a lot of agricultural goods. The shipbuilding issue is about China's longstanding policy of subsidizing Chinese firms and destroying foreign competition and capturing overseas markets. Rare earths dates back to 2010 with the first boycott of the Japanese. And what's just happened is that this is a reflection of China's effort to codify its informal coercion economically against other countries. The problem here, the most alarming thing, I think, is the rare earth situation. I think China's overreached by sharing its detailed plan that could paralyze the entire global electronic supply chain. And I think all nations should be concerned by that, and confidence in China will suffer as a result.
Speaking of China's strategic calculus here, Jeff, you've said before in the past that China tends to retaliate 100% plus 10% and eat the pain for nationalism. How deliberate are these latest moves that you mentioned by Beijing within its strategic playbook? And do you see Beijing holding the upper hand in these negotiations?
I think all of these things are very deliberate, especially the rare earths measures. You know, once you start digging into the details of that new regulation, it is extremely detailed. It had to take months to prepare. It was issued the day after a national holiday, so you know it was approved well before the national holiday. I think not only are these the same tactics, but as I said, these are just extensions of what we have seen before. And China is trying to tell President Trump that if Trump wants a trade war, it's really going to get a trade war. And I think both sides have very strong weapons that they can use against each other. I think this is a race to the bottom, and they need to stop it.
Okay, so if that's the case, and this hard-nosed approach, tit-for-tat approach, is not going to work, can you tell us what actually has worked, when negotiating with China before? I mean, what's happening in the back channels right now? Trump says, maybe he won't meet Xi at APEC, but Scott Bessent seems to be the adult in the room, saying they're still talking.
Yeah, I think they're seeking reassurances beyond the threats that are being made publicly. I don't think, for example, with rare earths, literally they could shut down the entire electronic supply chain. I don't think that's what China intends, and I think they need to give some kind of reassurances with that regard. And the same sorts of things with other issues. They need to make informal promises, maybe that they can't put down on paper, that will provide enough reassurance that there can be a meeting in South Korea and at least agreement on some terms. Nobody thinks that we're going to solve all the issues out there in a meeting in South Korea or even next year in Beijing. But they can come to some half measures or some kind of détente.
Right. So Jeff, all said and done, is there a case to be made for selective tariffs against China, perhaps in specific sectors? And was this the case as well with the Obama administration?
Well, I think that there probably are some areas where there should be tariffs. I think, though, the tariffs are not the best tool. If you ask me, I think that reciprocity in terms of market access is the best way to go. What China or what the U.S. cannot do in China, China should not be able to do in the United States. If U.S. Internet platforms can't function in China, then they shouldn't be functioning here in the United States. If people in the U.S. can't buy farmland in China, why are Chinese people buying farmland here in the United States? So personally, I think that kind of reciprocity, not the kind of tariff reciprocity that Trump has talked about, would be probably more effective.
Yeah, I want to get your reaction to Mr. Trump's new 100% levies. How do you read this return to large-scale tariffs, even after earlier rounds proved hard to sustain?
It's impossible to sustain 100% tariffs. We learned that in April when Trump backed down. I think what happened last Friday was that Trump suddenly appreciated the full impact of the new regulations. He reacted very emotionally. He doesn't have anyone to filter him or anyone to say no. So he sent out that Truth Social post, which was extremely emotional. And within 6 hours, by the end of the day, he was walking it back in public comments in the Oval Office, saying, sort of saying, well, maybe we can work something out, or it's possible that we can meet in South Korea. Since then, over the weekend, there have been even more conciliatory comments. But it goes up and down with him. He gets extremely emotional and then sort of calms down a bit, and that's what I think we're going to see.
Jeff, I'm also wondering whether or not both sides, have a list, of products, of goods. Top of the list would, I guess, be soybeans, cooking oil, or whatever, and they're just gradually going down that list with Trump, threatening to do this, and the Chinese side doing the same thing as well.
There's definitely a list. I mean, they've been talking about the list. The U.S. wants fentanyl cooperation, rare earths, sales opportunities. The Chinese want decreased U.S. tariffs. They want reduced export controls. They want investment opportunities in the United States. Whether they can, despite all of the problems that keep on developing, whether they can get through that list and find areas that they can agree on is going to be tough. I mean, for example, this rare earths measure just made creating investment opportunities in the United States a whole lot harder. If the Chinese are threatening to cut off supplies in the U.S. to cripple the global economy, why would the U.S. allow China to do the same thing through investments in the United States? So things seem to be getting more complicated, not less complicated.
All right, Jeff. So given the current dynamics, tariffs, export controls, and technology bans all in play, if you were to advise the U.S. trade negotiating team, what would your top priorities be?
Well, I think those are the priorities that President Trump has said. So no matter what I say, those are the things that he's going to go through with. As I say, I think they're going to try to find some middle ground in some of these areas. I would say decreasing some of the tariffs is a good thing. I never favored the tariffs from the beginning. I do think that the export controls should stay in place. His talk about reducing some of them, I think, was misplaced. And despite what I just said about investment opportunities, there are some investment opportunities that the Chinese could pursue in the United States that would not create strategic dependencies in the U.S. economy. So that's something to perhaps move forward on. And then on the Chinese side, I think they're probing right now to see how serious the Chinese are about some of these more dramatic policies that they've just issued.
All right, Jeff, thank you so much for talking to us on the show this morning. That's Jeff Mason, president of China Moon Strategies, and he's also a former assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China.